Hello and welcome to Leadership Loading. I'm Jason McClaren, and each week I meet with industry leaders and military veterans to discuss leadership in the workplace, veteran career transitions, and advice for those that are following in their footsteps. This is episode 2 with Nicholas LaGrassa.
Just getting your name and face out there as much as possible, so when your resume hits somebody's desk, that person already has a good idea who you are, knows your skills, and has a good working relationship with you.
Hey everyone, it's your host Jason McClaren, and today my guest is Nicholas LaGrassa. He is an emergency manager by trade, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about leadership in the emergency management field and some things that he's observed during incidents, and especially the Dallas police shooting in 2017. He'll go a little bit in depth on what he did and how he responded to that. But before we get to the interview, I want to remind you got to follow us on Facebook and go to leadershiploading.com to join our newsletter so that you can keep up to date on everything that's going on with the podcast. So with that, let's get the download from Nicholas LaGrassa on leadership and the emergency management field. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Leadership Loading Podcast. I'm Jason McClaren, the host for today, and I've got our guest, Nicholas LaGrassa. Nicholas and I, we met through the emergency management field, but we've been acquaintances for several years now, and he's going to come on and tell us some stories about some incidents he's been involved in and some leadership skills that he's used and leadership skills that are useful in the emergency management field. And I'm just glad to have him on today and just want to welcome him. Nicholas, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a professional emergency manager working in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I've done a little bit of everything as it relates to emergency management. I've been involved in mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery at the city level, the regional level, the university level, and the private sector. My most recent position was with Fannie Mae, and I would respond to disaster areas and work with local officials to get housing rebuilt as quickly as possible. That's what I've been doing recently. Right now I'm in between jobs, searching for that new opportunity. But I'm always learning about emergency management, always learning about leadership, always looking for those skills that are going to keep me on the cutting edge of our field and making sure I never get rusty. I love emergency management. I love what I do, and I couldn't think of a better career for myself.
So you've worked in several emergency management positions. What's your favorite so far, and why was that?
I would say when I was with City of Dallas, I was the senior emergency management specialist for mitigation and recovery, and I'm a big proponent of mitigation. And it's extremely overlooked in this profession, this sense that we can either stop disasters before they happen or mitigate them to 1% of the damage that they have the potential to cause. I feel like is very forgotten about. So to be able to pioneer that at the city of Dallas and say, well, why do we have to worry about flooding in this area? What can we do today to stop it? What can we do tomorrow to stop it? What can we do a year from now? And to be able to say, yeah, this area was consistently flooding up until this point, and then we did this, and now it doesn't flood at all. And to be able to say, we saved $4 in response for every dollar spent in mitigation. That's cost effective right there. And for me to be able to get in front of people and say, this is what we did, this is what the output was, and this is the long-term outcome, is really important to me.
Right. And I always harp on mitigation, without getting too much into the emergency management field for the listeners, but like you said, you can save, $4 on average on every dollar spent. And, I'm always, when I meet with people, trying to push that. And I'm shocked at how many agencies or counties or companies, they fail to, want to spend that money. And I think
Yeah.
that's an interesting topic there. I'm a big proponent for mitigation also, over response. And so I think that's interesting. So, all right. So the big topic for you is the Dallas police shootings. Can you start with where you worked at when that happened, and then kind of how you got activated?
Yeah, so I was with the city of Dallas then. I was one of the duty officers. It wasn't my week to be duty officer, but I had the experience of being ready to activate at a moment's notice. And I'll just take you through that first night and then what we did from before that, or from after that.
And real quick,
So that
before that, for listeners that may not know, can you just summarize what happened that night?
Okay, Dallas police shooting. It was on July 7th, 2017. We had an individual with a semi-automatic rifle disguise himself within a Black Lives Matter protest and took a surprise attack on two officers and eventually got up to a sniper level position and ultimately was responsible for the death of 5 officers, 4 Dallas Police Department, 1 Dallas area rapid transit officer. In addition, I believe 2 or 3 civilians were involved, but none of them were killed. It was all police
Right.
individuals.
Okay, now, and so you were a duty officer for the city of Dallas at the time.
Yeah, and so I was well acquainted with what needed to be done at any given point, but this was something that none of us really expected to happen. I mean, you can always say, "Oh, we're ready," but this was really on a different level.
Right.
So that night, I got off work. We knew the protest was going to happen, but nobody really expected anything. All the intel said that it was going to be a peaceful protest, so we weren't particularly worried that OE, Office of Emergency Management, was going to be activated. But I stayed downtown that night. I was at the movies, and around 7:30, 8 o'clock, my personal cell phone starts blowing up. I didn't have my work cell phone on me at the time, but I remember being very upset, like, "Oh, you're interrupting my movie. This better be good." And I guess I got a little bit of regret about that afterwards. So I leave the theater without looking at my phone. Movie's over. And they're directing people to, there's a manager saying, "Don't go downtown. There's a riot." I was like, I should probably look at my phone. And sure enough, it was a lot of conflicting information, but it boiled down to somebody was shooting at people downtown, and the initial estimates were 10 or 12 people were dead, and we got so I immediately got in my car. It was like, I'm already downtown. I might as well go in and see what I can do. I get through, I go to City Hall. I pass 2 checkpoints, which I had never seen happen before.
Right.
Get in, I get downstairs into the bunker, so to speak. And I was the second person in the office, or in the EOC, second from Office of Emergency Management. The first was our director, Rocky. And I immediately asked him, like, "What's going on?" He says, "I have no idea." but we've got all the channels. We've got 4 screens in the EOC, and everyone was on a different channel, and everyone had a different story to describe. So immediately I got to work. I sat down with one of the lieutenants. Yeah, I don't remember his name. I wish I did though. Sat down with one of the lieutenants for DPD and started working on a sit rep. We went through all the ICS documents, what we assumed would be an 8-hour deployment. It ended up being closer to 12 initially. And then from then on, it was for the next 7 days, we ended up doing rotating 12-hour shifts.
Right.
So that my first priority was getting that sit rep done, planning for, we did the first one for a 4-hour deployment with the second deployment 4 hours after that, and then a third deployment 4 hours after that. We wanted to make sure that we had enough time and space within those deployments, because this was a very stressful situation. We wanted to make sure as many people as possible were as clear-headed as possible. And the easiest way to do that was to rotate everybody in, everybody out.
Right.
And once we were able to establish a rhythm, I believe I ended up leaving at 4 a.m. So I got in at 8, got out at 4. I went back to my apartment, slept for 3 hours, walked back into the office, and worked another 6 hours doing logistics, moving command posts, making sure that FBI, ATF had what they needed, and left at 3, came back at 6. And then from then on, for the next 6 days, I was EOC manager during the night shift, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And I just was there in case anybody needed anything. We had ourselves, we had DPD, Dallas Fire Department, both a representative from the fire department and the EMS side of the fire department. We had an FBI agent. We had state trooper, and in and out, we had what I later came to find out was a Texas Ranger, which was really cool because I had never met a Ranger before.
Right. Definitely.
And so I did that for 6 days, and by the end of it, I was just so mentally exhausted, but we were able to do an after action report, talk about what was good, what we needed to do better. And ultimately, I believe that everybody working together made that bad situation run a lot more effectively than if it was everybody individually.
So a couple of things. You started off, you said you got in, you had different news stories on the TVs and all that. I'm sure there's a lot of rumors going around. So how did you combat the rumor control?
So one of the biggest problems, and I say problem with air quotes around it, was that the Dallas Office of Legal Counsel has a very strict interpretation of the public information disclosure. Like, the city of Dallas will never delete a tweet, will never delete a Facebook post. It's because it's public information. It's
Right.
always going to be there. So we had an individual who was carrying an AK-47 type rifle during the protest, and immediately he got flagged as a person of interest. And we had put on our Twitter accounts, this person is a person of interest. Please give us as much information as you can about him. And we got a lot of different tips from a lot of different people, and a lot more criticism, because not only did we identify the wrong person, we left that tweet up for, I believe it's actually still up.
Right.
Just because we weren't allowed to delete anything, and the public information officer swore up and down that this is the way it had to be. And so we took a lot of heat from that.
Yeah.
The other issue was we kept hearing over and over and over again, oh, there has to be 2 shooters. There has to be 3 shooters. Ultimately, it was that one shooter, and we were very, very blessed that it was only the one shooter. So those were our 2 main rumors that we sought to control.
Yeah, and I know the social media can get out there, and it can it can start a wildfire.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
Yeah. Speaking from the emergency management side, so this would have been a unified command?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Looking back, it was definitely a unified command, but at the same time, it didn't feel like how we were taught unified command would feel. You know, you go through ICS 300, 400, and they beat that into you. This is what unified command looks like. This is what area command looks like. And you have this idealized picture,
right.
But in reality, looking back, but it didn't feel like it at the time. It was just a bunch of us working together.
Right. And was everyone on site that was in command, or some of it virtual, or?
So DPD, Chief Brown, among others, were posted up. They were at City Hall, but I believe they were on the 2nd or 3rd floor. If there was a reason, I don't recall it. But I know he was in and out of the EOC throughout the night. I don't know if I don't know where fire department or Dallas Fire Department was located. I didn't know if there was an EOC individual or EMS. I knew they were all working together, but aside from David Brown, that was I didn't see any of the other ones.
Right. Yeah, so that kind of just reiterates the whole leadership of incidents, and that the incident commander doesn't always have to be right there in the EOC. They can be mobile. Well, it does help sometimes, but they've got other things they got to do, and we've learned that in incident command that delegation and setting those goals allows your ops chief and all them to operate independently and not have to have you sitting there watching over their shoulder. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I mean it's the 21st century. We've got all this technology available to us. There's no reason that everybody needs to be crowded in that one room, because I can only imagine how much more intense it would have been if we had 60, 70 people in our EOC at the same time. It would have been absolutely chaotic. But I know that having that level of separation so that DPD, FBI, ATF, DPS could all do their cop thing elsewhere from the EOC and just be able to report in to the EOC what they were doing at what times, definitely allowed for a more streamlined approach.
Definitely. All right. And then you talked about after action reports. For those that don't know it, and you said it's learning about it and learning how to do it better. Without being Monday morning quarterbacks, how can agencies, or organizations that are not government agencies, be more prepared for similar type incidents or mitigate against those types of incidents?
Intel. Be able to know what's going on in your city 8 hours from now. You're not going to know everything, but is there a major event coming up? Is it a spontaneous event? Is it planned? To be able to say as much information about the organizers as the participants, as attendees, as anybody else who might show up, to be able to say, that as much about that event as you can possibly be able to say, and just being able to, I don't want to say predict, but be more aware of the type of incidents that can turn into emergencies very quickly. And I think that goes back in many ways to mitigation and planning, which in my opinion is just extreme mitigation. To be able to say, we know this event is going to happen in 8 hours, in 10 hours, in 12 hours. What can we do in this first hour to plan for that, to stop anything from happening before it even starts? What can we do an hour before the event? What could we do, assuming the event is next week? What can we do today? What can we do tomorrow? And being able to say at the end of the day, this is the steps we took prior to the event to stop any serious consequences. And because of that, only these small number of things happened.
Definitely. And I mentioned organizations because there's a lot of organizations that hold large scale events, and they can learn from these incidents and, use these tools to mitigate those incidents and try to get ahead of that. And I think leadership and all organizations can learn from that.
Absolutely.
You mentioned a lot of the things you were doing during the incident. What skills did you learn that day that helped you become a better emergency manager?
Patience, being able to keep a level head at all times, being able to listen to people, being able to communicate your ideas more effectively, both through speak and writing. We all know what's going on in our head, and we all know that sometimes we can get tripped up, but being able to take a deep breath at times and know exactly what you're telling to somebody who may or may not have that same background of learning, of training that you have, and be, at the end of the day, if you need to, explain a concept or an event that you would to, in the same way that you would to a 5-year-old. If that's what it takes to manage an incident, that's what you got to do.
Yeah, sometimes you gotta, make it not dummy proof, but kind of you do. Not saying that people in those fields are dummies, but I used to be a firefighter, so I always joke I got to make it firefighter proof. So
yeah,
and
there's, I'm not trying to drag anybody or say that anybody during that event wasn't mentally prepared or anything. It's more of like an abstract concept, just like
Definitely.
being able to talk to somebody and be able to explain something, assuming they have no level of training compared to you, no background knowledge about the event.
Definitely, and that's true, especially with emergency management, because a lot of people don't get the same training, even though that's kind of the concept of it, is that everyone gets the same training. But it's been rolled out over the years, and you've got these different levels of management and people that have taken certain classes. And so, that person coming in may have taken that ICS 300 class, like you mentioned earlier, which is a classroom leadership incident command type class. But if they took it 5 years ago and you've been practicing it as your job for, your whole life, you're going to understand it a lot more than they do.
Yeah, and a golden rule that I kind of rely on is that treat everybody as if they've only been through ICS 1, 2, and the NRF training and the basic of the basic amount of emergency management training, and you're going to get a lot farther than assuming that this individual has 300, 400, and all these other niche trainings. Just assume that they have the bare minimum and build up from there.
Definitely. And for the listeners, I'll put all these classes in the show notes so that if you're interested, you can check them out and see what we're talking about and learn more if you would like to. So any tips for anyone? This whole podcast is about career development and leadership. So anyone that may be interested in what we do for a career, any tips for those people trying to get into the field?
Be patient. Be willing to volunteer at any given opportunity and get known. I say be patient because there is an extremely finite amount of these kinds of positions available. And from the context of the Dallas-Fort Worth area where I operate out of, in many cases, when one person retires or changes jobs or anything, there is a huge shuffle that happens, because if that EMC leaves, then somebody else who's an EMC at a smaller city may move over there, and then that smaller city's position is open. So maybe a specialist will move to that city and become the emergency management coordinator, and you get this huge rotation, and eventually it may be a couple months from that point, you get a base level emergency management planner position that opens up, and that's your time to move into the field. And the best way to do that is to be known, and either that's through attending emergency management meetings. Here in the DFW area, we have what's known as REM, the Regional Emergency Managers Meeting. It is a huge symposium, for lack of a better term, that happens every other month. We get at minimum 50 emergency managers. I've seen it get up to as much as 200 emergency managers, emergency management types, even emergency management students will show up to these meetings. There'll be a presentation, and that's the first hour. And the second hour is all networking. Just talking to people, catching up to people that you may haven't seen in a couple months, meeting somebody new that you've wanted to talk to but haven't had the opportunity, just getting your name and face out there as much as possible. So when your resume hits somebody's desk, that person already has a good idea who you are, knows your skills, and has a good working relationship with you. Because at the end of the day, we can teach emergency management. You can't teach a good personality. And volunteer, and that volunteering ties into that in many ways, because as much as it's good for people to know who you are and your temperament, your personality, things like that, they want to see your work ethic. They want to see what you can do in the field. And maybe that means getting involved in CERT. Maybe that means getting involved in the Red Cross. Maybe that's showing or setting a meeting with an emergency management coordinator and saying, I'd love to be your volunteer emergency management specialist or emergency management planner. And I'd love to be able to work with you and show you what I've got, so that you can eventually open up a position and maybe I can get that. Just being able to put yourself out there as much as possible and get everybody to know your name, everybody to know what you can do. And hopefully long term, that means everybody's going to be fighting to get you to work for them somewhere down the line.
Definitely. And that, I think a lot of those traits reign true for all the careers, depending on where you're at. I know up here in the Dallas area, EM is a wide niche because we have, such a big metroplex, and the University of North Texas has a degree program for that. So yeah, like you said, once one person moves, it kind of shuffles around. It's similar with other industries and the hubs for those industries also. And so, yeah, like you said, getting known and networking, I think is one of those things that kind of balances between all the industries. Any other professions you ever looked at? Or
I'm in the process of potentially making the shift to urban planning, because that ties in along with my passion for mitigation. And When I was working with the North Central Texas Council of Governments doing rural and urban mitigation plans, this idea of what if we build these cities to be disaster proof when we're building them. When we're building new construction, what if we start with the concept that we're disaster proofing these types of businesses and residential areas? Disaster proofing is one thing that I keep coming back to as a concept from the ground up, saying these are the hazards that are in our area, so let's build to combat directly those hazards: tornadoes, flooding, wildfire, things like that. So I've been looking at urban planning as some way to, for lack of a better term, to scratch that itch. I'm trying to get into, USC has an online program for a master's in urban planning that I'm trying to get into. But that's definitely somewhere that I would look at as a eventual path down the line.
I like that how you're spinning what you've done and your background into it's still a career shift, but it's still related enough to where it doesn't look like you're just jumping jobs, but then also that you're doing something you want to do. That's very, very interesting. Back on mitigation and disaster proofing, why don't these states come in and make these counties, change their building code? Like the county I live in, we are guaranteed to get a tornado every year, but no one does anything, and it just comes through and wipes out half the city or half the town. And why doesn't the state say, you will build your houses to this standard and you will put safe rooms in every house, or that, do you know anything on that or have an opinion on that?
So I know that the state of Texas is very big on local control and home rule. And at the end of the day, it's up to cities to implement these kinds of strategies themselves. And then when you build up from there, counties and then the council of governments and then the state, each level as you get higher has less and less ability to actually implement serious kinds of standards. That's a feature in the state of Texas, not a bug. So it relies a lot on cities being willing to say to developers, no, you can't build that way. You have to build this way. You have to make your windows windproof up to a certain amount. You have to put in storm rooms. You have to put in flame resistant siding. And developers see that as costly. They don't want to do that because they don't have to sell a house that way. They can just sell a normal house that doesn't have all that protection for the same amount of money as somebody's willing to buy it. And once you start adding $20,000 worth of mitigation, lots of developers are flat out unwilling to do something like that because they think it's going to cost them in the long run. So they lobby these cities to not have to put those kinds of standards in place to begin with, and so that they're not obligated to do anything other than the bare minimum. From a government standpoint, mitigation isn't pretty. It's not flashy. It's not cool. And that was one of the kinds of things that when I went to the University of North Texas, I specialized in planning in response to terrorist incidents because that was cool. That's what I wanted to do. And that's what everybody wanted to do. And when I got to the Council of Governments to do mitigation planning, it was boring at the time. I mean, I was 22. I didn't know any better. But I developed this work plan and said to myself, nobody is doing mitigation because it's boring. You can be that mitigation guy that everybody goes to, and then everybody knows who you are. They're asking you for help. They're asking you to do their grant programs. And long term, you're the guy that everybody wants to be on your team because for whatever reason, you know what you're talking about. And because it's boring, nobody wants to invest the time because it doesn't look as good from a public standpoint. Building a flood-resistant neighborhood isn't as flashy as having that SWAT team. And then once you've got a SWAT team, you got to practice it. You got to use it at every opportunity. So why would we mitigate against terrorism when we can have this SWAT team with hundreds of thousands of dollars in gear and use that as every opportunity we can and have that as a advertising point for our city? It's like, oh, it's the safest city in the county because we invested all this money in the police and fire department. It's like, well, you could have invested a quarter of that into these projects and you wouldn't even have to worry about it to begin with. But it's easier for people to say we spent $800,000, and this is a number that I'm just pulling out of the air, $800,000 on our public safety equipment and not be able to say we spent $200,000 on mitigation projects.
I kind of knew the political side of that. I figured you could explain it better than I could. But yeah, mitigation isn't sexy, like you said, and I come from the fire side, and so when I was trying to sell building developers on installing sprinklers or making it mandatory, like you said, they balk the same way. Well, it's going to add 1.2 million of estimate, to the project, and nobody's going to see it. It's just pipes that are on the wall, and nobody wants to do it when they could put that money into something that looks pretty. So it's kind of it's one of those things that they don't think about it until it bites them.
Pretty much.
Yeah. All right. When you're not working, what do you do outside the workplace? Any hobbies or interests?
I'm into powerlifting in terms of just like a workout regimen. That's what I do most days. I'm at the gym. Beyond that, I live in Richardson with my wife. We've got a lot of pets that we take care of. And we go to the movies a lot. That's my big thing is I love watching movies. I love commenting on movies. And so that's what I do most days and weeks is I'm either at the movie theater, maybe I'm at the gun range, maybe I'm just at home with my wife and our dog and our cats and our chickens. Just trying to have that level of separation from work to be able to say, this, for lack of a better term, this house is my safe space. This is my relaxation area, and to never be able to say, I brought work home.
Definitely. We've always got to unplug, and I'm still working on that on my end is unplugging when you're at the house and getting that family time in.
It's definitely a challenge these days because so many people rely on cell phones, and once you put your work email on your cell phone, you think for a moment, oh, this will help me stay more communicated during the work hours, and that quickly turns it into answering emails at 9 p.m., 6 a.m., going into a situation with as much information as possible is always good. But there's a point where you got to say to yourself, I'm not answering another email after this time, and I will respond to it. I won't respond to emails before this time.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in our career fields, being 24/7, basically, you've got to turn those notifications off after a certain time. Otherwise you'll get emails all night long. So,
yeah.
So.
And they're never important emails.
No.
No, nobody's emailing you at 2 a.m. because it's a life or death situation. If it's that bad, call me, and I'll
Yeah.
definitely answer my phone. But don't email me that you need me to respond to something because at 2 a.m. because I'm not going to answer it.
Yeah, we had duty officers that would send out, at the end of their shift a report, and so depending on when their shift ended, they'd send out that email that went to 100 people, and I was always on that list, and it's always going off. But like you said, it wasn't important. It was just a report of what they did during their shift.
Well, that's all for this episode. I want to thank Nicholas for coming on and telling us a little bit about leadership and emergency management. Once again, go to leadershiploading.com, follow us on Facebook, and join us on all your podcast platforms. With that, this is Jason McClaren signing off.